Welcome to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams. Thanks for joining me again, Daniel.
Hi, Jay. Thanks for having me back.
Always good to catch up with you at the end of each week to find out what's going on, what are some of the major foreign policy issues that we should be keeping our eyes on. More often than not, I think it's important to listen to what you have to say, because what you have to say is most likely not going to be talked about in the mainstream media. So we want to find out things that aren't laid out there for propaganda purposes and try to find out what's really going on. Well, one of the things that you brought to my attention this week is that there seems to be a color revolution taking place now in Armenia. And Armenia, I think, it's an interesting country. Actually, my dentist is Armenian. I know a lot of Armenians, and pretty good people from what I've known over the years. It's really an interesting country in that it's sort of, it's landlocked, and it's in between. It's got Turkey on the west. It's got the Islamic Republic of Iran on the south. It's got Azerbaijan. It's sort of the southern part of the country is encircled by Azerbaijan, which is Islamic. Obviously Turkey is Islamic, and Iran as well. But on the north, you've got Georgia, which is Christian, as is Armenia. This is really an interesting, I think, very interesting but very important area, Daniel, because of the pipelines that are supposed to be going in through Turkey and all of the stuff that's going on there. But talk to us about the color revolution. What do you know about it, and who might be behind it? Would it be the usual suspects?
Well, it's still in the early stage. What happened is about a week ago today, a group of young people gathered in the capital Yerevan to protest an electricity hike. I think it's something like a 13% hike in electricity prices. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't sound automatically that awfully interesting when you think about it, because prices are hiked all the time.
Yeah.
Their currency has devalued a couple of times. And I think not necessarily surprised that it happened, but for some reason this time, a bunch of people got out into the street and started protesting. And a few of them decided to march toward the presidential palace, at which point they were, and this is last Friday, they were hit with some water cannon, as probably would happen anywhere if you try to march on the White House.
Sure, absolutely.
Would happen, but it fits the pattern of Ukraine, of the Maidan, where it started out this way, and they started marching toward government buildings, and were stopped with violence. And this wasn't particularly violent, but still they were stopped with force. They've kept protesting all week, and the reason I'm increasingly suspicious that this is a color revolution is that, having looked at these things for a number of years, as a matter of fact, believe it or not, Jay, I was in Armenia in 1998 when there was one of the first color revolutions that ever happened was attempted there. I didn't even call it color revolutions back then. But it has a lot of the components that I've noticed in these color revolutions. And the main one, Jay, and you'll recognize this, is that the NGOs that are behind this are very tech savvy, and they're also primarily foreign funded by the United States. For example, the Civilitas Foundation runs some TV stations, and they're very much behind the protests. They're funded by foreigners, including the U.S. government, George Soros, and so many of these organizations are foreign funded. They have a very recognizable, almost like a Madison Avenue branded type of look and logo. This is called Electric Yerevan, and the symbol, interestingly enough, it used to be, the clenched fist was the symbol of the color revolutions. This one has a slightly different twist. It is a hand with the middle finger sticking up.
Oh my goodness!
So this is. This, I think, gives it a trendy, young appeal. And essentially what they're trying to do is, I think, overthrow the government. And the reason why is, if this is a color revolution, Frankly, the U.S. has been trying to undermine Armenia for quite some time. Armenia was one of the countries like Ukraine that were on the track of asking for EU membership and Western integration. They did a U-turn back in 2013, and they decided to go ahead and join the Eurasian Economic Cooperation.
Oh, yeah, sure.
With Russia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. At the time, it was going to be Ukraine. So this was the beginning, I think, of the U.S. Interest in overthrowing the Armenian regime and putting in a new government. But the other component that I think is very important is that this is very interesting. The electric company is wholly owned. It was privatized, and it's wholly owned by a Russian firm. So you have in the protests a very pronounced element of anti-Russianism, of Russophilia, aggression towards Russian. So they've been able to, if this indeed was put together by the spinmeisters, you've been able to put a lot of eggs in that basket, So at this time, it's ongoing. The president of Armenia offered to meet with the protesters on the very first day to discuss the issues, and they refused to meet with him. So
they're not really. That's not really the issue then.
No, and I think they canceled the price hike as well, and that still didn't get them off the street.
So that's not the issue. Well, it's. I think probably that it seems to fit the pattern, Daniel. I mean, I think back to the Arab Spring when food prices were rising then very seriously for those people. And there was a natural anger and angst about the economics of that period, and that played very well into the NGOs or whoever stirred that up, it seems. And so clearly, I mean, they're looking always for some just cause, right, to get people that might not be politically orientated but might say, hey, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's get those scoundrels that are raising my electric. I don't want to pay more. So let's use force, and instead of the marketplace, let's use political force to turn things around. And then if they can get masses of people to demonstrate, then they can possibly overthrow and get rid of the governments. But I see, again, you mentioned George Soros. His fingerprints seem to be on every color revolution. It seems, this guy.
Yeah, and as I mentioned once on the show with Dr. Paul, the thing about George Soros' foreign policy, the organization, there has never been an organization or a cause that he supported overseas that was at odds with the intention, the foreign policy goals of the U.S. government.
Yeah.
So he is essentially an arm of the U.S. government in funding these things.
He may actually be more than an arm. He and his colleagues. I mean, this is just my thought. He and his other wealthy billionaire colleagues that may be the head of the State Department of these actions. For all we know, I don't know. But in any event, that's really interesting too. Then, Daniel, because I think about this whole pipeline that's going through there into Turkey. Anyway, I guess it wouldn't cut through Armenia, though, would it?
No, but still, you're right. Pipeline politics, I'm sure, has something to do with it.
Yeah.
And the other element that's interesting, Jay, that I forgot to mention, and this is subtle, but the protests take on a nationalistic flavor. And that was definitely the case in Ukraine. And I think if this is indeed the puppet masters playing this game, they're able to play on people's emotions. I was in Belarus in 2006 when they tried to have what they called the Denim Revolution. And all of the revolutionaries were extreme patriots. They were waving the Belarusian flag. They didn't want to be compromised with Russia. And the same is happening in Armenia. Even people that I've seen on Twitter that I follow who are pretty sane on these things and pretty savvy, they're saying how nice it is to hear Armenian patriotic songs being sung in the square. So the people that do this are well trained, and they're very, very smart. They know how to play on emotions.
Yeah, play on the nationalism, and then use it to ultimately take away the sovereign rights.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's just incredible. Yeah, it is an irony, but that's what these one world government guys are trying to do. And of course, they made a gigantic gain this week, in my view, by getting the TPP passed, but that's another issue perhaps
Yeah.
for another time. Well, Daniel, I just think this is one we want to watch carefully then going forward, huh? Is what might happen what might happen in Armenia, and I know, we talked about Macedonia. Things seem to be cool down there, but it's more or less because the government there seemed to be bought out, perhaps.
Yeah, they did, I think, capitulate. Although it's not, I don't think it's completely over. We need to keep an eye on it. But I think Armenia is definitely a big enchilada. Armenia has moved closer to Russia. Russia actually has a military base in Armenia. It's the only place, I think, outside of Russian territory that there is a base, an actual base. Its purpose is to keep Azerbaijan and Armenia from going at each other's throats over Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an enclave. But nevertheless, there is a Russian base there. So if you can imagine a nationalistic overthrow, they kick the Russians out, they get out of the Eurasian Union, go toward the European Union.
Right.
Then next thing you know, you have a NATO base in Armenia.
Right next to Russia.
Yeah.
And well, it certainly is very interesting, and I wonder, with these Islamic states surrounding it too, if there might not be a play on, getting some wars going there between Christians and Muslims. Is that a possibility?
Certainly, there's in the Caucasus, there's always been this volatile mix, and interestingly enough, the neocons have been very active in supporting the Chechen cause.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at some of the Chechen friendship societies and look at the memberships, they're all U.S. neocons, and you wonder, why the heck do they care about Chechnya and a bunch of Muslims down in Chechnya? Well, it's all about Russia and putting Russia on its back heel.
Right.
So
Stirring up wars to destabilize things so they can.
Yeah.
Well, this is the evil part of this world, the way things work. But anyway, I think as citizens we need to know about what's going on. Another article that appeared at the Ron Paul Institute website this week. Secretary of Defense Carter says to Russia, "Don't drag us back into the past." What is he? He's blaming Russia for dragging us back into the past? Isn't it the United States that's surrounding Russia these days through NATO?
Well, I kind of had a little, I wouldn't say fun with the article, but I made fun of Carter a little bit. It's a crazy policy. The U.S. and NATO are desperate to have the Germans become more militaristic. They want them to spend more money on weapons, and they want them to be willing to deploy their army wherever it's needed, at forward bases in the Baltics. And the Germans have, they have a collective memory. They've also been told for, 7 decades that militarism is bad and that they're guilty for World War II.
Right.
And the first part of that is right. The second part of it is not right. There's no such thing as collective guilt. Nobody who did that is alive today. But nevertheless, it's been ingrained in them. And so here comes the U.S. saying, we need to get Germany on board with, spending more on its military. And but then it says that Russia is trying to drag us into the past, and we won't allow that to happen. So it's the U.S. that is putting bases on the Russian border. It's the U.S. that's moving in heavy equipment. It's the U.S. and NATO that have radically increased the pace of their live fire exercises near the Russian border. But all of a sudden, it's Russia trying to drag us to the past of the Cold War.
Yeah, but Daniel, of course we're putting our guys on the border of Russia because Putin is an evil guy that is trying to annex all these countries into his control, right?
Yeah, but they don't feel the need to provide any proof for that. They just have to scare the heck out of Americans. And
all they have to do is say it enough, and you tell a lie often enough, and people believe it, I guess. So
and people like you and I who want to say that's bull, they'll say, well, you're just you're just in the pay of the Russians, or you're some sort of Putin lover, which is as ridiculous.
Putin lover, right?
I'm a nuclear war hater. That's what I am.
There you go. I mean,
but it's the thing that makes someone like Carter, he comes to the Pentagon directly from the military-industrial complex. He's been in and out of government, but when he's not in government, he's working for the war machine.
Right.
So he comes in and he has a lot of I'm sure a lot of people he owes a lot to. But he says such absurd things. He says that the U.S. doesn't seek a Cold War or a hot war against Russia, but it defends the rules-based international order. So, and then I wrote in the article, so meanwhile Syria has been destabilized, Libya has been destroyed, Afghanistan is a mess, Ukraine is overthrown, and all of these are illegal according to international law, but they were started by the U.S. essentially. So what rules-based international order?
Well, whatever the U.S. and George Soros and the people that control our country want, I guess that's the order.
I said that I said at the end, this rules-based international order for Carter and his neocons means that the U.S. makes the rules and the U.S. issues the orders.
Yeah, I guess that's right. Unfortunately, if only more people knew what was going on, Daniel, I think we'd have a far different outcome. Politically, there would be more unhappiness and more activism on the part of Americans. I suppose if they ever put a draft back in, there might be more serious questions asked again. But overall, the big picture, in my view, is that we're looking at it has to do with money, with economics, with power, and that in fact the petrodollar. That's what I keep coming back to, and that was established. And all of this has so much of what's going on here. We just touched on it a little bit ago. The pipeline that Putin wants to put in and sell his products into Europe, and obviously, our NATO doesn't want that, or at least elements of NATO doesn't want that. So, anyway, an article that was sort of touched on the economics of all of this, I think, was written by Ron Paul and posted at the website this week, titled "Will Seizure of Russian Assets Hasten the Dollar's Decline?" And the article talks about how the Court of Arbitration in The Hague awarded a $50 billion judgment to shareholders of the former Yukos oil company. And Yukos, of course, Russia took over that company and jailed the CEO of that company, I believe, for quite a few years. And as I know, having seen him interviewed on Charlie Rose, this man that was the CEO of Yukos was really anti-Russian and very much pro-West, and I would imagine that had something to do with the actions of Putin. But talk to us a little bit about Ron Paul's article, if you would.
Well, it's just as you say. It's a lot of it's about the timing. You have this $50 billion judgment against Russia, right at a time that the Russians were talking with the Greeks about possibly finding a way to help them out of the crisis that they're finding themselves in the EU. And of course, the U.S. is right in there with all of this, clinging to this idea that there's a unipolar world where the U.S. is at the center telling everyone else what to do.
Yeah.
But as Dr. Paul mentions in the column, the world is not really unipolar. It's Russia and China are there. They do exist. And as the U.S. extends itself and extends its empire, it weakens itself, and it actually hastens its own decline, its own financial decline.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's pretty much historical. Great nations and superpowers do that to themselves, don't they? They become overly aggressive and they ruin themselves from inside. They just decline because of their economics, and I think the debasement of the currency clearly encourages and enables this sort of excessive indebtedness that we've taken on, and all kinds of malinvestment that occur because of the manipulation of markets and interest rates and so forth. How can you have capitalism and free markets and prosperity if you disable or you don't allow price discovery by artificially pushing interest rates down? And so I think this is really interesting. Will it hasten the dollar's decline? I would imagine that this, among many other things, but clearly Russia is kicking back, China is kicking back against all of this that's going on. We've talked before, Daniel, about how the sanctions placed on Russia is pushing Russia closer to China. They're working very, very hard to try to survive against this unipolar world that the George Soros and others seem to want push for. So I guess it's really getting. I think it's really getting very dangerous what's going on. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely getting dangerous. I think that the U.S. elites are believing their own propaganda, believing they're masters of the universe. But
yes.
Russia is selling tons and tons of gas to China, and they're not doing it in dollars. I think you probably saw it. I think maybe it was on Zero Hedge today. Something about the amount of gas that Russia sells to China is now more than Saudi Arabia sells to China, or something like this, and that's pretty significant. That's a direct challenge to the dollar as a reserve currency.
Daniel, one more thing I just thought of now, and I want to ask you about it, if you have any thoughts about it. There seems to be some warming of relations between Russia and Saudi Arabia now. Do you think this is just politics, or maybe Saudi Arabia is willing to talk to Russia, or maybe some games being played in Saudi Arabia trying to affect the policies of the Obama administration towards Iran and other places, or what do you have any opinion of what this is all about? Because I believe a high-level official went from Saudi Arabia to Russia, and maybe Putin visited or is going to visit Saudi Arabia. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I've been following it a little bit, and I think a lot of the pro-Russian people out there who just want to see America get a black eye will say, this is the beginning of something big. And that may be the case, but I hesitate to think that some huge geopolitical changes will take place overnight.
Yeah.
I think it's more of a process than a single event. There may be something to it, but I think it's much too early to judge. I just think it's way too early.
Yeah, maybe posturing on the part of both Russia and Saudi Arabia. Who knows? What games are being played? Well, in any event, is there anything else you might want to leave us with? We should keep our eye, I guess, then on Armenia, watch what goes on there in the next few weeks.
I would definitely keep an eye on Armenia. I would keep an eye on the steady deployment of military weapons and troops onto the border with Russia. I think it's a very dangerous thing, and it's not going to stop anytime soon.
No, and I don't see the neocons certainly think they are and we are invincible, it seems. So
yeah.
I don't know. It's all I can see is you hear of these awful things that took place in France today or yesterday, this week. Rising hatred towards the West from Islamic groups. And I just keep hearkening back to what Dr. Paul said when he was running for president. The reason they came over here is because we're over there.
Yeah.
And I don't know why we can't get it, but obviously some people don't want to get it. And as we've said many times, there's an awful lot of money to be made. I still think, Daniel, if somebody wants to make money, one of the surest ways to do it in the stock market is to own military weapon companies.
In the short run, you're probably right, but we will run out of money.
Yeah, well, things are yes, it's not a recipe. I think the Romans learned that, and a lot of other great empires have learned that since. That overextending yourself will be the end all. Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for being with us again, and look forward to doing it again next week.
Thank you very much, Jay. It's always great talking to you.